We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off.
Well, we're off to an auspicious start today, aren't we? So first of all, this is actually Doors of Divination, and I have the Far Fridays title up on Blog Talk. So if you're here for the divination stuff, you're in the right place. And obviously we can see a good friend Lenise on hold listening, because she knows she's got the psychic uplink. So how this happens is I have to program these shows in advance. And because I have 3 different shows with 3 different topics, essentially, I've got to do, I can't, and I'm not doing it every day. It's not recurring. It is not a recurring theme because it's broken up by days and different themes. So if it was a recurring theme, I would just hit recurring, which I kind of did at one point. But now I have to change it in a way that is manual, because, well, things change. And if I don't change it far enough in advance, the old shows pop up. And kind of that's what happened today. So in the spirit of Mercury retrograde, I apologize, but we're here to get into some divination, and I will do that shortly after a little bit of housekeeping. The other thing about today's show is I'm looking at the doors. I've got all these different files, sound files that are my audio clips. I could play them at any time. I'm looking at them. And I would have normally have played the Doors of Divination opening, but I went to click on it, and instead of that I got my Philip K. Dick opening, and I didn't even get the finished one. I got the unfinished one, which I don't think I've ever really played on the air, which wasn't bad. It was fine. But it's quite a start to the day. So part of all of this is that, theoretically we're going through the Mercury retrograde. If you've got your head locked around that, I'm going to talk more about Mercury retrograde today and how it relates to a changing view of the universe. And then also we're going through daylight savings time. It's another kind of time shift, a temporal shift that we're experiencing. And for me, I've been doing some outside work, and it's changed my schedule around a lot. And I've had to actually crunch more work time in late at night, which means I've been going to bed later at night, and I'm getting less sleep. So I'm a little loose on the threads of things. And I've got to figure out this new schedule in a way that's worthwhile. Anyway, it's the 16th of March, and we're almost through Pisces. We've got about 6 more days left of Pisces, and then we're on to the biggest stellium in Aries that we've seen in quite some time. And I'm going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. In fact, I'm going to talk about it as it relates to the Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games opens on March 23rd, and I'm going to look at the chart of the Hunger Games. If you go to my website, you'll see my latest post. It is a small but pretty condensed post around the latest promotional picture that was released for the Hunger Games. And if you don't know about the Hunger Games, you're sleeping under a rock, because the Hunger Games is going to take the entertainment world by storm on the 23rd of April, because there are 3 books already out there. The trilogy for the Hunger Games has already been written, and there is a rabid, foaming fan base for the Hunger Games. And the fan base for the Hunger Games is mostly teenage girls. And the reason why is because the heroine of the Hunger Games is a character by the name of Katniss Everdeen. And if you don't know the narrative of the Hunger Games, here's the narrative. Here is the synopsis of the Hunger Games. The Hunger Games exists in the future. And the place that it exists in is the United States. But the United States is no longer the United States. The United States is a place called Panem. And Panem is comprised of 12 districts that are represented by 2 youth every year to participate in the Hunger Games. Now, the vision of America is a word that you are probably familiar with, and if you're not, you will be. It's a dystopian vision of the future, meaning it's dark. It has got a sense and an air of heaviness and oppression. When we talk about dystopian futures, we can throw out films like 1984 and Mad Max in the same sentence. Blade Runner could be a vision of a dystopian future. So the Hunger Games has that same feeling to it. It is it's oppressive. And from the clips, when you look at the clips, there is a sense of uniformity about people in terms of their dress, in terms of their income bracket. There definitely seems to be a chasm in the classes. And the upper classes are living very well, and the lower classes are pretty much all at the same level. So, there's this feeling of kind of a national socialism and sort of socialistic fusion, which is theoretically where we're headed here in this country, which is a conversion of capitalism into a version of China, where the state pretty much runs everything. And there is kind of a capitalistic overlay, but it's not anything like we experienced or were weaned on in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Those days are over. Anyway, that's what the Hunger Games feels like. And so what happens is, and by the way, they have a president who is he's a dictator, and his name is Snow, and he's played by Donald Sutherland. So every year, so here's what happened. Here's what happened in Panem. There was a revolt, and the people lost. Keep that in mind. The people lost, and as a punishment and as a psychological tool to remind people who is boss, Snow and the ruling class of Panem have the Hunger Games. And the Hunger Games are where two, a boy and a girl, 2 teens, 2 adolescents from each district square off against one another out in the wilderness. And when I say square off, it is to the death. It's to the death. And generally speaking, only one will emerge. And this is not just a contest and a psychological tool to torque the attention of the people, but it's also, well, that's exactly what it is. It's a reality show, and people have to watch the Hunger Games. They have to watch the children from their state within Pan Am, their district within Pan Am, live or die. It is part of their psychological conditioning. So the storyline goes that every year they have a lottery, and they choose a boy and they choose a girl, and from this one district in Pan Am, a young girl is chosen. And the girl that is chosen has her sister step in and do tribute for her. And the sister's name is Katniss Everdeen. And she steps in for her younger sister. And so Katniss and her partner are set to go off and fight each other. Or not fighting, but fight other kids in Pan Am. So anyway, how all this relates to astrology is that the other day, 2 days ago, they just released a new image from the Hunger Games. And it's an image of Katniss Everdeen. And she is pulling back an arrow on a bow. And they released the image on when the moon was in Sagittarius. And I thought to myself, this is fascinating. This is absolutely fascinating. Here we have an image of the Archer released on the Sagittarian moon. And some of the writing I've done on the Hunger Games is that it is specifically directed to a group of children who are born during Pluto in Sagittarius. And I've written about this on my website and how generationally there are memes and themes within the media that are carved out, literally carved out via generational sign based on Pluto. For instance, when I was a child, I'm Pluto and Virgo. So when I was a child, the theme and the meme that was very prevalent during my youth was Mary Poppins. And if you look at Pluto and Virgo, it's all about work and service and doing things that are less than glamorous, for the glory of God or for the glory to serve. This is our programming. And I'm not saying that there isn't something intrinsically valuable in that. There is. Don't get me wrong, there is. But what Mary Poppins did is that it glorified this whole concept of selfless service or serving or working in less than managerial capacities and enjoying it. So what do? Mary Poppins is a nanny, but she's not just any nanny. Oh no, she's not. She is a witch, a very powerful witch. So here you go. You can work at Starbucks, but you can be a warlock on the side, so to speak. Right? I mean, that's kind of the theme of Mary Poppins. Dick Van Dyke, he's a chimney sweep, but he's a warlock. It glorifies service in some ways. So that was a theme and a meme for my generation growing up. And there are others. And I went through generation and generation and generation and broke it down and carved it out. And so what we're looking at now with Pluto and Sagittarius, the Pluto and Scorpio kids, they had sort of the tail end of Potter. They had the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They had Twilight for sure, a very big subterranean underworld vampiric meme for them. That was what they were weaned on. Vampires and zombies. Vampires, zombies, reptiles. Pluto and Scorpio. Now we have Pluto and Sagittarius, and these children are now just coming of age, the earliest of which in that generation are about 15 years old. Maybe 16 on the outside. And what is Sagittarius? Sagittarius is the archer. Sagittarius, is the outdoorsman. It's the huntsman. It is the centaur. It is half man, half horse, and the attributes that we associate with Sagittarius are sports, nature, philosophy, law, religion, animals. These are all very Sagittarian qualities. And what do we see in the Hunger Games? We're seeing the outdoors, nature, certainly law and oppressive law, philosophy. There is a philosophy that is going to be emerging around the Hunger Games. It's already a trilogy. I've mentioned that. And obviously, how they are fighting and fighting to the death is with rudimentary weapons, knives, swords, slings, slingshots, and bow and arrows. Okay, you see what I'm talking about now, the milieu that I'm beginning to build, because this is now interpenetrating an entire generation that has Pluto and Sagittarius kind of, inside their astrological matrix. It is the key that is unlocking their astrological matrix. I have a son that is a Pluto Sagittarius kid, and I can tell you firsthand what these kids are like. When I say kids, I'm talking about my kid, I'm talking about kids that are older. I've had some contact. It's really funny. My good friend Stephen Kent has a daughter who is 15 years old, and she was born in 1996, which puts her right at the beginning of the Pluto and Sagittarius team group. That's where she is. And I used to babysit her when she was just a young kid. So I was there at the beginning of her life. And now I'm watching her grow up and be a part of this sort of the head of the comet for Pluto and Sagittarius. She's a really interesting kid, and her mom and dad have given her great tools and lots of music to listen to. And I'm not talking just any music. I mean, my friend Stephen is a world-class DJ as well as a musician, and he's deeply steeped in world music. And people from Mongolia and Tibet and Iraq and all these very diverse places from all over the world filter through his house and play and stay. And so his daughter has had a lot of exposure to very, sophisticated music from all over the world. What music does she like? Country and Western music. Country and Western music. So this, to me, was very interesting because Pluto and Sagittarius kids have a mind of their own. They're gonna figure things out on their own. They're very independent thinkers. And what I've seen from the younger generation is that they are amazingly cohesive as children together. They're competitive. Don't get me wrong, they're competitive because again, I have my son in martial arts, and he boxes and he wrestles, and he's in a group of kids that are older than he is as well. So we're talking 11, 12, 13. So they're in the middle of the pack for Pluto and Sag. And I watch them, and they train hard, but they don't take things personally. And there's a great amount of esprit de corps with these kids, which I find to be really, really interesting. So they can be competitive, but they're not competitive to the point where, like when I was a kid, competition for me as a kid with some of my friends was really cutthroat. Let me tell you, you play to win. We were more in some ways like the Hunger Games people. But what I'm seeing with this group of children is a very kind of democratic spirit, that pervades who they are. They get along well. They're team oriented. They're very different than the Pluto and Scorpio kids. And when something like the Hunger Games comes out, and it comes out right at a particular time, what's happening here is there is now you can look at this in two different ways. Like if you are Jungian, you would say that this is an extension of the collective unconscious, right? Here is the collective unconscious manifesting these symbols of archery and Sagittarius and the outdoors and a dystopian future, that the collective unconscious, which is the accumulation of our soul and our knowledge and our subconscious aggregate, and spitting it back out to us so that we can see it and view it right in front of our eyes. And that the collective unconscious is the place where myths are generated out of. This is a Jungian concept, right? This is all Carl Jung, extrapolated and built upon by Joseph Campbell and a lot of the post-Jungians, people like Robert Bly and so on and so forth. Now, that would be one explanation of the Hunger Games. But the timing of the Hunger Games is very interesting, not just in terms of its astrological symbolism, but also in terms of at when it takes place. It's taking place just as this generation is beginning to come into adolescence, and their hormones and their endocrinology is getting turned on. And what I have talked about in previous shows is the binding and the weaving and the braiding of images and symbols and cultural influences that adhere to us as we are coming into sexual potency and adolescence. This is when the chakra system begins to really open up and open up in a big way. And it's kind of like your first sexual experience. Your first sexual experience is a very powerful sexual experience and can really imprint you. Now, thank God we can kind of move beyond these things, because for a lot of us, the first sexual experience is kind of, either awkward. And I've talked to people who've had great first sexual experiences. That's awesome. But, it's like for many people, it can be either awkward or in some instances, incredibly traumatic. And, luckily we're able to move beyond some of these things. But that experience is very powerful, and it sticks to us in a very big way. So what happens now is we open up our chakras, especially the second chakra, which has been, children can't have feelings of desire. You don't have to have, your endocrine system turned on fully to experience that. I know as a kid I did. I'd look at, a picture and go, ooh, pretty lady or something like that, But what happens is that it gets turbocharged in adolescence, and the chakras open up in a much bigger way. And then if you look at this whole process of pouring ideas, pouring images, pouring symbols, pouring influences into the individual at that time, they begin to accumulate in that chakra. And really, we're talking the first and second chakra. And these chakras they're basic, they're fundamental. They're the most basic and fundamental chakras that we have: survival and sex, survival and procreation, reproduction. And now we've got these images, and we've got these symbols, and we've got these chords that are in these chakras for a very long time. Why? Because they're just opening, and they are invaded. Theoretically, they're invaded. They're invaded by influence. So now we have a generation of Pluto and Sagittarius, and their chakras are opening, and bang, what are they getting? They're getting the Hunger Games. They're getting the programming, and it's attaching itself to the base, the chakra base of their experience. So how will that affect them? Well, over time, they will build a belief system. Over time, they will be given a world that begins to cohere to what they've seen and experienced and attached to on a collective level, and they will already have been massaged, psychically and psychologically massaged, to accept that world, to think that this is the world that they saw in the Hunger Games. It begins to make sense to them. So the Hunger Games, in my estimation, is a form of predictive programming that is being inserted into a generation. And we're seeing that now. Now, the Hunger Games opens on the 23rd of April. And I'm going to open up the astrological side of things here. And we're going to look at the 23rd of April. And we're going to look at where specific planets are. And I'm going to break this down. And it's going to be very interesting if you have any kind of interest in this at all. The 23rd of April is, and it's been chosen, it's a Friday, and most new films open on Fridays. But why the 23rd of April? Why not the 30th of April? Or why not, the week before the 23rd of April, which would have been what? The 16th of April. Why the 23rd? Well, we're going to get into this. So when we go to the ephemeris and we look at the 23rd of April on 2012, what we're going to see here is something very interesting. So the 23rd of April, I'm sorry, it's the 23rd of March. My bad, not April. 23rd of March. Okay, there it is, 23rd of March. So next week is when the Hunger Games opens. So here's what we have. We've got a stellium in Aries. Sun in Aries, Moon in Aries, Mercury in Aries, Uranus in Aries. 4 planets in Aries. And Aries is the sign of the warrior, right? God of war. God of war. And what are the Hunger Games? The Hunger Games are wars. It's a war between the 12 districts of Panem. That's what the Hunger Games are. And Aries is also the sign of the individual, the personal will, the I am. And, what does Katniss Everdeen, who is the main character, the heroine of the Hunger Games, what does she emerge as? She emerges as the I am. I am going to sacrifice myself for my little sister. I am going to represent my district in Panem's Hunger Games. I am going to survive. I am going to win. I am going to live. She is the embodiment of the I am. And it's very clear if you've seen any of the clips from the Hunger Games that this is her modus operandi. And then we have Sun in Sagittarius, 2 degrees right at the beginning of Sagittarius. Moon in Sagittarius at that time will probably be right around 2 degrees as well. So you're going to have a Sun-Moon conjunction, almost exact. Mercury, 0 degrees, right at the beginning of Mercury. All 3 of those planets super tight. And then you've got Uranus coming in at 4 degrees. So really we're talking about from 1 to maybe 5 to 6 degrees of Aries, all those planets conjunct. That is a super collider of Aries coming together for the opening of the Hunger Games. And again, let's go back to Katniss Everdeen and the picture of her as the archer, as Artemis in the Hunger Games. It was on the moon in Sagittarius. Which leads me to the next topic, and that is the evolution, if you can call it that, the cultural evolution, or at least the cultural morphing of the image of women as it relates to the mass media and myth in the collective mind. Okay, and I touched on this just briefly on the blog, and I'm going to go back and fill this out or fill this in on the blog because I felt like it was not as complete as it could be because I wanted to have some visual representation. All right, so let's go back in time. Let's go back to the 1940s. The image and the collective image of woman on a mass level, and I'm talking a mass level. I'm not talking about like the Betty Davises or the Jean Harlows, because there's always been pockets of women in the media or in film that have represented femininity in more, how should I say this, darker, less less Apollonian sort of perspectives and views, like Theda Bara. Theda Bara was a silent film star, and she was considered a vamp. And a vamp is another term for a woman of loose moral standing. I'm not going to repeat Rush Limbaugh. Okay. So we have these images of women in film that go back a long way. Jean Harlow, Marilyn Monroe, Mae West, and then darker images, people like Betty Davis. But they're pockets. What we're doing is we're, especially with some of the glamour girls of Hollywood in the 30s and especially the 40s, we're beginning to mold this image of Aphrodite, and that is on a collective level. But on an individual level, and mostly if you look into films during that time, they certainly didn't have television, but advertising, woman is portrayed, and not only portrayed but marketed to as Ceres, the goddess of grain. That is really the image of woman from around the turn of the century up into the 1950s in America. She was the woman who stayed at home. She prepared the meals. She was the dutiful wife. She was the goddess of grain. She was the life giver. In Egyptian mythology, she would have been Hathor. That's who the American woman was at that time. And this was certainly reinforced in advertising in a very big way. And I'll give you a clear example why and how. This was during the 1950s, before we begin to really go into a radicalization and acceleration in the mythology of women vis-a-vis Aphrodite. And I'm going to get there. But there's a great story. Most people who are into advertising know this story, and it centers around Edward Bernays. And food companies like Betty Crocker and General Mills and all the companies that make cake mixes and stuff like that, and muffin mixes, they were coming out with these pre-made mixes. Before this, women would take flour and they would take some yeast and they would take a little this and a little that, and they'd make their own cakes or their own breads. This is where we get the whole idea of making something from scratch, right? And what happened? And then you had the industrialization of food. And this is where you have your box muffins and box cakes, and they all come from a very specific period of time, mostly the early 50s, post-war America. And when they first came out into the marketplace, these were not very successful. So, General Mills and, Betty Crocker and, the other manufacturers, they hired Edward Bernays, who is the father of modern marketing and advertising, a pretty insidious man to boot. Not a great guy. Trust me on this, not a great guy. And what he found was that women were loath to make these recipes. Why? Well, they felt like that they were cheating their husbands out of the experience of being Ceres. They felt like it was taking a shortcut. It was undermining their character in some ways. They took pride in the fact that they could do these things from scratch. And just opening up a box cut against the grain, pun intended, with their experience. So what Bernays thought of, well, why don't you just have them break an egg? He figured out that the egg on a psychological level would connect them to the whole process of life and birth and death and being a woman. The egg and Bernays are really an interesting story. Very interesting. Because Bernays also worked for the egg manufacturers and the meat manufacturers of America as well. And he's also the father of the modern breakfast, again, using the egg. So the egg is a very interesting theme, and because Bernays figured out that the egg just taps us into the reproductive and the generative processes of life. So by the women of the time cracking an egg, putting that in their pre-made mix, it gave them the sense that A, they were doing something, that they weren't cheating, and B, they were now also allowing the kind of series mythology from a reproductive and a generative perspective rubber stamp that act. And once they put the egg into the mix, so to speak, they were able to legitimize this, and then women began to buy the mixes. So, but I'm telling you, I'm sharing this with you because series was the image for women at that time. And that changes. That changes to when we get to Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe is iconic for many reasons, but she's iconic mainly because now Aphrodite becomes the major theme in the mind of men. Because men have been schooled on marrying women of good stock, right? Would she be a good mother? Would she be somebody who would stand by you if you lost your job? Would she be somebody who could stay home and cook and anchor the home life while you theoretically went out and slayed beasts in the form of new clients? Now we have a new image that plants itself directly and squarely into the brain and the second chakra of men, and that is Marilyn Monroe, Aphrodite incarnate. And we see the one, there are two images that we always associate with Marilyn Monroe. One, the Playboy image where she's laying down on the red blanket, right? The red blanket, or the red sheet, whatever that red cloth is that's ruffled, which, by the way, is blood. And that color red is specific. It wasn't black. It wasn't blue. It was red. And because what happens to men, right? Well, when men see that, where does the blood go? Exactly. So that's one image. That was sort of the edgy image. But the collective image is Marilyn Monroe standing on that sidewalk and the wind blowing up her skirt. Everybody knows that image. And that's the image that captures the collective imagination and psyche of men. And she's delighted and thrilled, and she's wearing a white dress, by the way, which is virginal. It's virginal. And the wind represents spirit, and it's lifting her up. So it's an uplifting image, but it's also very sexy. So now here we have Aphrodite coming into the mind as not just Aphrodite, but a virginal Aphrodite. She's approachable. It comes in to the man. He's like, she's a virgin. She's not a whore. I can let Aphrodite come into me. I can embrace this. And that image alone begins to take men away from the Ceres archetype and the grain goddess as life partner. Now men begin to think about beauty as a form of qualification to be with somebody. Not just somebody who would be a good mother, who would make your meals. Now we must live with Aphrodite. Now we must be entrained and entranced by beauty and the seduction of Aphrodite. No man can live without it. Why? Because theoretically, it would make us better men, more powerful men, stronger men. Who needs the Ceres of the world now? We've got Aphrodite. Or maybe we could have Ceres at home and go find Aphrodite somewhere else and live a double life and bifurcate our consciousness. By the way, Carl Jung was quite good at this. He had his wife, and then he also had Toni Wolff, who was his mistress. And Carl Jung, by the way, violated every principle of modern psychology by having an affair with one of his clients, who Toni Wolff became. So now we're off into Aphrodite. And by the way, there's not just one Aphrodite. There's a number of Aphrodites, right? There's Jane Mansfield, who was a rival of Marilyn Monroe. Then there's also Sophia Loren, the Italian Aphrodite. Then there's Brigitte Bardot, the French Aphrodite. Do you see what happens here? Once the archetype is inserted, it cuts across countries, cultures, media, all around the world. So Italian men, Gino Brigitte, it's all happening right at that time. Shifting our awareness away. Now, let's not, look, men have always treasured beauty. Don't get me wrong. People treasure beauty. I don't want to be sexist. But it was a kind of a rarefied experience in some ways. There was a practical application of who we chose as our mates. So we'd be attracted for people generally based on the ability to survive and reproduction. That's what drove our choices. But as the 20th century progressed and we had more income and the whole idea of attracting somebody and the reason why is very different. It became less about survival and more about gratification. And that's another reason why Aphrodite comes into our consciousness. But again, it's moving us away from this unit of the man with Ceres as the archetype. And this goes on for quite a while during the 60s. And it's continually reinforced along the way. You wanted an Aphrodite refresher, Raquel Welch. Now it's Aphrodite, but there's an eroticism with Aphrodite. We're beginning to introduce carnality. And there's a whole, it begins this whole kind of wave of soft porn. Jane Fonda was another Aphrodite that was introduced into our consciousness, right? Breakfast at Tiffany's, Clute, where she plays a prostitute, Barbarella, the soft porn of Barbarella. So this, and Jane Fonda begins the movement in some ways away from Aphrodite to another kind of archetype, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But this is what's happening here in the 60s. It is the age of Aphrodite. And now we fast forward a little bit. Actually, we fast forward a lot. And Aphrodite shifts, and it becomes something different. The image of woman now, and really which has been sort of taking place since the 90s onwards, is less about beauty and more about sex, and sex in the underworld. And now we're talking about Isis. And clearly, we see women now, and over the last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, in full-on Isis mode. Women that take us into the underworld. Seductive women that have an edge, that are kind of dark. Maybe an image of this would be sort of like, not Vampira, what's her name? I'm having a blank moment here. But she was, Elvira, thank you. Elvira would be kind of an early, kind of a precursor of this sort of dark. She's Aphrodite, but she's taking you into different places. right? Marilyn Monroe is Aphrodite, and she's kind of innocent. Elvira is not innocent. Elvira is somebody very dark and takes you into the underworld. Well, there are more and more archetypes and images of this kind of underworld experience. Aaliyah, Queen of the Damned, underworld, right? There was Lisa Bonet in the film with Robert De Niro, Angel Heart. You know, there's this movement with those movies and those characters that are now taking us down back into our root chakras and our first chakras, but it's a different kind of woman. Yes, she's seductive, but she's dangerous, and she's hinting at death, right? Fatal Attraction, Glenn Close is another example of this. Yes, she's hot. She's seductive, but what happens? She literally nearly kills Michael Douglas. Sharon Stone, again with Michael Douglas, seductive, takes him into that underworld place. So now we're talking about Isis. Here we have woman as dangerous. She's dangerous. She's seductive. She's dangerous. You know, she'll screw you up, ruin your life. She might even kill you. She is the seductress, taking you down, 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 down into these dark places. And here at the end of this run, which really starts with Basic Instinct and Glenn Close and all that, those films from the 90s. Here at the end of this run, you're seeing Gaga, the new Madonna, Rihanna, Nicki Minaj, Beyonce. These are the archetypal queens and princesses of Isis, the expressions of Isis. You know, there are times where you look at Lady Gaga, like, wow, she's kind of attractive. Oh, she's not so attractive. Oh, she's kind of dangerous. You know what I mean? And so this is the antithesis of Ceres in some ways. You know, Ceres, has her own relationship with the underworld, and she emerges. She goes away in the wintertime. She comes back, in the spring. She grows the greens. It's cyclical for Ceres. So she does have a relationship with the underworld, but it's not like Isis. Isis dwells in the underworld. That's her place, right? So anyway, we've been taken to the end of the line with femininity via Isis. It is the death of femininity in some ways. It is the death of the typical feminine, starting with Ceres, Aphrodite, Isis. And now what do we have? We have Artemis. Artemis is the new archetype, and Artemis is personified by Katniss Everdeen and the Hunger Games. And this is where it's all headed. Artemis is not feminine. Although you may say that she's redefining what feminine is, potentially. Artemis is almost always a symbol for women inside of the LGBT culture, okay? It is. She is, it is. Now, am I saying here that the Hunger Games is getting ready to turn all of America's young women into lesbians? That would be a very, very kind of conservative angle to take. And my answer would be potentially. Because what we're talking about here is a reorientation of women and their ideas and their thoughts about who they are and, what motivates them, and especially in adolescence, when these memes are dropped right into the second chakra. They begin to think about themselves in different ways. Now, maybe we might need these young Artemises to help us as we progress into a dystopian future, potentially. Or maybe it is just yet another collective manipulation. As a man and as a male, right, as an older male, I grew up with this whole concept of the male as hero. It was imprinted on us, printed on me. You know, for an earlier generation, it was John Wayne. Frankly, I didn't like John Wayne. Never liked John Wayne. But we all have our versions of the hero. For my generation, really, it was the anti-hero. It was Dirty Harry, the guy that skirted the edge, had a gun. Maybe he was just as psycho as some of the people he was trying to chase down. But the thing that separated him was that he had a badge and he had a more refined sense of morality. But the idea of the hero was firmly in place for the male. There are very few versions of the hero now for men, for young men. And I mean, the whole idea of the hero is kind of conflated anyway, and maybe overrated. But really what I'm talking about are positive role models for young men. They're just really not there. And what you're seeing reinforced over and over and over again are incredibly positive models for girls and women. And Katniss Everdeen is another example of that. And what does that leave for boys in our culture? What does that leave for men in our culture? If you watch advertisements on TV, how many times does the man look like a complete and utter moron who is at the, the man not only looks like a moron, but he's put in place by his smart-ass kid and his wife, who is obviously way smarter and way more together than he is. How many times have you seen this played out in commercials on TV? I have seen it many times. Go watch some of the Kraft macaroni and cheese commercials or the Kraft whatever they're making commercials. And you can find men just, reduced to puddles of ineffectuality. And this is a theme that's being broadcast across the media constantly. Dads on TV shows, what are they like? There was a time when a dad had a modicum of respect. Ward Cleaver. He was a good dad. Right? He was a good dad. And fathers now on TV are, for the most part, objects of ridicule. Married with children. That's where it also, it didn't start there, but it certainly got accelerated there. So sometimes I feel like a lone voice in the wilderness, I got an email from this guy, Dr. Eric Karlstrom, who was supposed to be on my show last Sunday night. And he went to my website, and he decided that he didn't want to be on my show because I was into the occult. I thought that was really interesting, that I was into the occult. I understand the occult. I was raised in the occult via our system and the world that I lived in. I was swimming in occult symbolism, and I was initiated into the occult via drugs. It was a mass program, and I was many people that was indoctrinated into that program. I understand the occult. I get it, and I don't. And here's what I have a problem with, right? So when I talk about chakras, some people will say, well, that's the occult. I'm sorry, they're real. Chakras are real things. They exist. It is not occult. It is spiritual science that is associated with the endocrinology of our bodies. They exist. It is not the occult. Astrology, you can say it's the occult. I've seen it way too many times pan out in a very big way. In fact, I had 2 readings this last week. People were just, their mind bulbs were popping over how exact I was nailing their lives based on astrology and solutions that could be based on astrology. So in my own way, I guess I'm out in the front lines trying to take back these symbols and trying to do my best to take back the cosmologies of all this stuff and redefine it and use it on my own terms. And I don't think I'm the only one. There is a dark, shadowy manifestation that results in the manipulation of these symbols and these ideas and the spiritual science that is being applied against us. We can, and in my humble opinion, we can take the power back. And the reason and how we take it back is we have to ground these things in a much bigger way, in a way that is, in some ways, well, many ways, respectful of a greater source, a source that is, the symbols are not the gods or the God. They are just pieces of navigational markers that, in my estimation, are the manifestation of God. And God, for me, is changed rapidly. I got to tell you. I've been watching some of the Electric Universe videos, and they've just been blowing my mind. Absolutely blowing my mind. And the whole concept of what the universe is changing for me very, very quickly. So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to get at here with all of this is that we have the ability to recraft reality in a very different way. And I'm also trying to share with you that I'm not going to say I'm misunderstood, because I think people understand me pretty well. But it's easy for people to say, oh, well, he's a conservative, he's a conservative prig because he thinks that there is a conspiracy against men. And it would be easy to paint me into that corner, or it would be easy to paint me into, oh, he's an occultist. So now put those two things up, right? Here's one guy who thinks I'm an occultist. Here's maybe somebody else saying he's a conspiracy theorist who basically dabbles in all these kind of arcane right-wing conspiracies, and yet I'm an occultist. Put those two things together. How does that match up? I'm just telling you what I see as a man, and the images and what I would call the psychological and emotional, in some ways, degradation of the modern male. And you can step back, and people step back, oh, well, yes, they are. They deserve it. They fucked up this world. They deserve everything they get. Fuck the men. Look what they've done. I don't agree with that. And I'm not going to accept it. But here we have the Hunger Games now with Artemis as the new emergent model and symbol for America and the world. I guess I've only got an hour today on the show. Man, Mercury retrograde is killing me. Absolutely killing me. Wow. So anyway, I apologize, number one, for this not being Doors of Divination today. I apologize, number two, for it only being an hour show. But I'll get right on this starting on Sunday and Monday, and we're going to talk, and I'll be back on the regular schedule. I've got to work things out. Anyway, I want to thank you for taking this journey with me today and following me along a very circuitous path, the labyrinth of consciousness and the archetypes of astrology and women and their emergent role in the matrix, in this matrix that is continually forming around us. Anyway, God bless you all. Use your head to discern what's real, your heart to stay open to what's possible. I'll be back on Sunday night, I promise. And I'm trying to get Visible on and a few other people, and we're gonna get into this a little bit more. I'll see you on Sunday. Take care.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words, I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this. Such an impression is a clue that at some past time point, a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this, an alternative world branched off.